Well, we've been talking about the divisions in the Middle East, which continue to tear apart the fabric of our society and around the West as well, with anti-Semitism at its highest rate since the Second World War. So let's bring in the Director of UK Lawyers for Israel, Natasha Hausdorff, who's here in Australia, I'm pleased to say, and is at the moment in Melbourne. Natasha, great to see you. Thanks for coming back on Outsiders. Many things we could talk about, but I just wanted to quickly... You are a lawyer, you're an expert on this topic. One of the things that often comes up is, oh, the settlements, Israel's got these settlements, they're illegal, they shouldn't be there. Can you give us your take briefly on the legality or otherwise of the settlements throughout Judea, Samaria and other parts of Israel?
Good morning. Well, it's very good to be with you. Of course, the allegation of illegal settlements is primarily based on two false premises, and they are both to do with the application of international law. The first is with respect to the status of the territory. And what I would urge any lawyers or even interested individuals to do is simply seek the proper and equal application of international law to Israel as to any state, because there is a universal rule of customary international law that determines the borders of newly emerging states at the Declaration of Independence, in Israel's case, on the 14th of May, 1948. Israel has just marked its Independence Day earlier this week. And that rule dictates that a newly emerging state inherits the pre-existing administrative lines of whatever unit preceded it. Simply put, in 1948, when Israel came into existence, as a operation of that universal rule, it would have inherited the pre-existing lines that included the West Bank and East Jerusalem, what so many misguidedly refer to as occupied territory. Now, of course, that territory was occupied between 1948 and 1967 by Jordan, but when Israel recovered that territory, it applied a temporary administrative framework to it in pursuit of a future peace agreement with Jordan and in anticipation that under the Land for Peace formula, it would be expected to provide some of that territory in exchange for peaceful coexistence with its neighbour. Of course, that temporary administrative framework has remained, but the critical thing is that it doesn't change the underlying status of the territory. What we have seen since then is the creation of a Palestinian autonomy in areas A and B of the West Bank. They enjoy self-governance in the West Bank, the Palestinian Arabs, as they did and continue to, unfortunately, in the Gaza Strip. We've seen the consequences of that with the violent Hamas takeover in 2007. But the fundamental misapplication of international law here concerns the status of the territory and the misrepresentation of that as occupied. There's another false premise here, which is to do with the application of Article 49.6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. This is a prohibition on forcible transfer of populations in occupied territory. It's important to note that it was drafted in response to the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, where they were forcibly deported to labor camps, concentration camps, and death camps. And this provision is being abused, and it is being used in order to justify this canard of illegal settlements and illegal settlers. It's important to note that these are individuals who have moved to Judea and Samaria and the West Bank of their own volition as an expression of their own free will. This is not state transfer. So just alone on those two false premises, I think it's important that we seek a proper application of international law. Not to say that it's mind-boggling that this idea that Jews should not live in certain places just because they are Jews has gained currency and legitimacy. And I think quite apart from the application of international law and the proper application of that, we need to be pushing back on such a morally repugnant suggestion.
Fantastic. James?
Well, and this morally repugnant suggestion, as you call it, I mean, this is historically quite unique when you talk about populations that have moved from one place to another, have been resettled after a war and so on. It all comes down to an Arab rejectionism, doesn't it, that's quite, unique, that when Israel was formed, unlike any other state that came out of the empires that fell after the wars of the 20th century, this was the only one that has had and continues to have this third, fourth, fifth generation of rejectionism by its neighbors. And this seems to be supported by a large segment of the international community, which seems really bizarre to me, given it's the same international community that, was responsible for helping to create Israel as something for the Jewish people, as not a colonial movement, but really a decolonizing movement out of the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire.
And the significance of the Jews being the indigenous people. I've been learning a lot about indigeneity in the week that I've spent now in Australia, and that's a critical message. Of course, it's UNRWA and the support that is provided by the international community for that organization that has perpetuated exactly what you're describing. The only people for whom refugee status is passed down generation to generation is the Palestinian Arabs. And it is historically been on the premise that once Israel is destroyed, they will be resettled in Israeli towns and territory. But there is an added misapplication of international law here. You've referred to situations of occupation and indeed transfer of settlers in a real sense, not in the false allegations that we're seeing with respect to Israel. But this does exist around the world. And Professor Eugene Kondratovich has conducted a detailed study of all of those instances, Nagorno-Karabakh, Northern Cyprus, Russia with respect to Abkhazia and Georgia, just to name a few. In none of those instances, in situations of real transfer of individuals and real occupation, is this allegation made. So again, we're faced with international law which is being made up and falsely applied to Israel. And that has consequences for the international legal system more broadly, not just Israel, I would suggest.
Rita.
We've seen an enormous increase in very overt anti-Semitism, violent acts. We've had police warn Jews that they're going to be arrested for looking openly Jewish during a Palestinian march. And I think we've got some footage that has just emerged from London of a Jewish man, again, being identified as a Jew and chased. Natasha, in that scene, the man is identified as a Jew and he has to essentially run for his life because there's aggressive people coming after him. What is the solution to that? How do you combat that sort of hate and propensity for violence?
Well, the first thing is to recognise it and to acknowledge that this modern form of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment, or the hate of the Jewish state is not acceptable. And the mask slips in those sorts of situations when individuals who say, oh, we have no problem with Jews, we just object to Israel. Well, those anti-Zionists are utilizing this modern acceptable face of anti-Semitism. And the fact that the mask has slipped in so many of these recent situations underscores the importance of us drawing a line and saying racism of any form is unacceptable. And so long as law enforcement and governments around the world are seeking to make excuses for hate of the state of Israel, which is ultimately Jew hate, then unfortunately, I think we're going to see instances that you've just played repeated over and over again.
Natasha Hausdorff, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Hope you enjoy Australia, the rest of your trip here, and many people have enjoyed seeing you and meeting you, and thanks so much for coming on Outsiders this morning.